Hello and welcome back! Let us move on to the final video for chapter 5, where in this video we'll be learning about fermentation, which is the type of cellular respiration as done by living organisms to generate ATP without using any oxygen. As usual, before we go into the content, let's have a look at the learning outcomes for this subtopic. I hope that by the end of this video, you will be able to explain what is a lactate fermentation, alcohol fermentation, and also state their importance in our industry. If you're ready, let's start with the definition. So we can define anaerobic respiration or fermentation as a catabolic process that makes a limited amount of ATP from glucose or other organic molecules without an electron transport chain, and that produces a characteristic end product such as ethyl alcohol or lactic acid. Okay, definisi ni macam panjang kan? Jadi mari kita cuba untuk break down definition ini. Let's break it down and try to understand bit by bit. Anaerobic respiration or fermentation is incomplete oxidation of glucose to carbon dioxide, ATP, and if you're looking at plant cells, the characteristic end product is ethanol. And if you're looking at animal cells and also fungal cells, the characteristic end product is lactate. Now, both these will produce ATP. Okay, so daripada glucose, dia akan jadi carbon dioxide, ATP, mungkin hasilkan ethanol, mungkin hasilkan lactate. And all of this will occur in the absence of oxygen. From fermentation, only a small amount of energy in the form of ATP is produced. And fermentation generates ATP only by substrate level phosphorylation during glycolysis. Kalau kamu ingat, aerobic respiration, kita ada glycolysis, ada Ling reaction, ada Krebs cycle, dan oxidative phosphorylation. Manakala untuk fermentation, kita cuma ada penghasilan ATP melalui substrate level phosphorylation. So only during glycolysis. And there are two types of fermentation. The first is a lactate fermentation. So this is the kind of fermentation that will produce things like yogurts. And there is alcohol fermentation, which will produce things like alcoholic beverages. So let's learn about each of these two types sebab prosesnya berbeza dan hasilnya juga berbeza. Let's dive in and learn more about lactate fermentation. Lactate fermentation is when, in the absence of oxygen, animal cells or muscle cells will undergo lactate fermentation. So, sama ada persekitaran tu memang tiada oksigen ataupun ini dalam badan organisme yang biasanya perlukan oksigen tapi masa tu mungkin sedang bersenam. Okay, so maybe you're having a vigorous exercise, so the oxygen levels in your body become lower, or in that part of your tissue become lower. Then you'll have lactate fermentation. Lactate fermentation happens like you see in this diagram. So, untuk lactate fermentation, kita akan start dengan glucose. Glucose akan dipecahkan kepada dua molekul pyruvate melalui glycolysis. So, during glycolysis, you're going to generate two molecules of ATP via substrate level phosphorylation. And also at the same time, it's going to convert two molecules of NAD plus into two molecules of NADH plus 2H. Biasanya, kalau dalam aerobic respiration, dua NADH ini akan dibawa kepada electron transport chain untuk digunakan menghasilkan ATP. Tapi, dalam lactate fermentation, dua NADH ini tidak akan melalui ETC. So this is now extra electrons that has nowhere to go. So when you have extra electrons with nowhere to go, you would do lactate fermentation, where you're going to take that pyruvate and you're going to take those extra electrons and put it into the pyruvate so that your NADH goes back to NAD plus and your pyruvate becomes lactate. Kenapa penting untuk kita buat ini? Supaya kita ada NAD plus untuk terima elektron, supaya kita boleh pecahkan molekul glukos yang seterusnya. So let's look at the text explanation. One molecule of glucose will undergo glycolysis and produce 2 molecules of ATP, 2 molecules of NADH, and 2 molecules of pyruvate. So in the absence of oxygen, pyruvate will be reduced by NADH to produce lactate or lactic acid. Benda yang sama, dua nama berbeza. NADH after this will be oxidized to NAD+, and NAD+ is regenerated so that it can be reused in glycolysis, so that glycolysis can continue and they can have more energy. Lactate or lactic acid is then converted back to pyruvate if it is in the human liver. And the chemical formula for this reaction is glucose becomes 2 molecules of lactate plus 2 molecules of ATP. Simple kan? Begitu saja kamu perlu belajar untuk lactate fermentation. Okay, that seems simple. So let's learn about the second type of fermentation. The second type of fermentation is alcohol fermentation. For alcohol fermentation, it is when in the absence of oxygen, plant cells or yeast or bacterial cells will undergo alcohol fermentation. So this is what the reaction looks like. We have glycolysis to produce 2 molecules of pyruvate. That pyruvate is going to be decarboxylated to become 2-acetaldehyde. 2-acetaldehyde will accept electron from NADH and then become 2 molecules of ethanol. And this is the text explanation. 1 molecule of glucose will undergo glycolysis and produce 2 molecules of ATP, 2 molecules of NADH, and then 2 molecules of pyruvate. So macam tadi, kita mula dengan glycolysis. Dalam alcohol fermentation juga, ATP dijana melalui glycolysis sahaja. Sekarang tiada oksigen, tiada ETC. Macam mana kita boleh ambil NADH ini, buang elektron dia supaya dia jadi balik NAD+, supaya kita boleh buat glycolysis yang seterusnya. Caranya, kita tukar pyruvate ini kepada sesuatu yang boleh terima elektron. This pyruvate will be converted into acetaldehyde or ethanol. Acetaldehyde juga dikelar ethanol, 2 carbon molecule, through decarboxylation. So we take out 1 molecule of carbon dioxide from pyruvate. It becomes acetaldehyde. And this acetaldehyde or ethanol is reduced by NADH to produce ethanol. NADH is now oxidized to NAD+. NAD+ is regenerated so that it can be reused in glycolysis so that glycolysis can continue. Begitu saja explanation untuk alcohol fermentation. Dan jangan lupa, kalau kamu mau buat equation, if you want to do an equation, you do like this. Glucose becomes 2 molecules of ethanol plus 2 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 2 molecules of ATP. So there are some similarities when we compare between lactate fermentation and alcohol fermentation. The first similarity is that both would occur in the cytoplasm or the cytosol only, and both occur in the absence of oxygen. And both of them will only produce 2 molecules of ATP for 1 molecule of glucose. But they would also have their differences. So let's compare between lactate fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Lactate fermentation will only occur in animal cells or muscle cells, whereas alcohol fermentation will occur in plant cells, yeast, and also bacterial cells. Lactate fermentation, the products are lactic acid, also called lactate, and ATP. Whereas in alcohol fermentation, the products are ethanol, carbon dioxide, and ATP. In lactate fermentation, the final electron acceptor is pyruvate, whereas in alcohol fermentation, the final electron acceptor is acetaldehyde, also called ethanol. Lactate fermentation will not require intermediate substrate. Jadi pyruvate itu boleh terus terima elektron. But in alcohol fermentation, it does require acetaldehyde or ethanol as an intermediate substrate. Maksudnya untuk alcohol fermentation, dia tidak boleh terus guna pyruvate. dia perlu jadikan dia kepada benda yang temporary. So pyruvate itu harus dijadikan kepada acetaldehyde, barulah acetaldehyde boleh terima elektron dalam alcohol fermentation. And last but not least, another comparison is that for lactate fermentation, decarboxylation does not occur. So, kita tidak buang mana-mana molekul carbon dioxide. Tapi dalam alcohol fermentation, decarboxylation occurs and it involves the release of carbon dioxide. So, those are the differences between lactate fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Fermentation is important in our industry. It's important in bread making, making of dairy products, making of alcoholic beverages, and making of local fermented foods. So let's have a look at how fermentation plays their role in each of these aspects. So when it comes to bread making, fermentation plays its role through yeast. So yeast would undergo alcohol fermentation in the absence of oxygen. Carbon dioxide produced by baker's yeast allows for the bread's dough to rise, and that's how you get nice, fluffy, and light bread. Fermentation is also important in the making of dairy products. As I've stated before, it's what we need to produce yogurt. So if we take the example of yogurt, yogurt is lactate fermentation by a bacteria called Lactobacillus species. Lactobacillus species produces lactate or lactic acid. Kalau kita ada bakteria ini dalam susu, dia akan buat lactate fermentation. So in the presence of lactate, okay, bakteria itu duduk dalam susu, dia buat dia punya respiration, dia hasilkan lactic acid. Bila lactic acid berada dalam susu, dia akan kurangkan pH susu. It will lower the pH of the milk that it's sitting in. And when the pH is lowered, it's going to cause the coagulation of the protein, forming yogurt. And yogurt tastes sour because it contains that lactic acid. So bila pH turun, denatured, dia jadi gumpal-gumpalan, and that is yogurt. Masam sebab acid. Coagulation of milk produces curdles, and those curdles is also what is used to make cheese. So untuk lactate fermentation ni penting untuk hasilkan yogurt, penting juga untuk hasilkan cheese, dan banyak-banyak benda lain yang berkaitan dengan susu. Okay, and then of course, fermentation is important in manufacturing alcoholic beverages. So examples of alcoholic beverage here is wine and beer. So wine is alcohol fermentation of yeast on grapes, whereas beer is the alcoholic fermentation of yeast on this grain called maltose. Maltose is a sugar that you can find from germinating barley seeds. Okay, and then last but not least, fermentation is important in making local fermented foods. So we need fermentation to do things like tempe. We need it to make things like dose. And then we can also use it to make the rice tapai. Okay, ini adalah tapai yang biasanya dimakan oleh komuniti Semenanjung, di komuniti Melayu. Okay, it does produce ethanol, and it does give that sour taste, but not to the point where it is intoxicating. Oh, it feels like a very short subtopic because it is. So far in this video, we've already talked about what is lactate fermentation, what is alcohol or ethanol fermentation. Okay, so lactate and alcohol fermentation. And we also talk about its importance in our industry. We can also take this time to compare between aerobic and anaerobic respiration before we end the chapter. So there are similarities between aerobic and anaerobic respiration, of course. And those similarities are both aerobic and anaerobic respiration would involve glycolysis, which is the oxidation of glucose into pyruvate. Both of them will produce ATP. Both of them will produce ATP by substrate level phosphorylation. But there are more differences for us to compare. So kalau kita mau bandingkan antara aerobic dengan anaerobic respiration, of course, you can do this comparison by yourself. So I won't be reading all of this. To point things out, you can compare general things like, does it need oxygen? What kind of processes does it involve? How many molecules of ATP will be produced? Where does it occur? What is the end product? What is the oxidizing agent that are involved? And who is the last electron acceptor in anaerobic or aerobic respiration? So, kalau kamu mau buat perbandingan, boleh buat perbandingan menggunakan beberapa kriteria tersebut. And we can also compare the differences between cellular respiration and fermentation. So, cellular respiration, kita boleh bahagi kepada aerobic respiration dan anaerobic respiration. Fermentation, kita boleh bahagi kepada lactate fermentation dan alcohol fermentation. As you see here, this column is not really in your syllabus, but we are including this in your lecture notes just in case it's useful for you in the future. Okay, so boleh compare based on these different criteria. Take your time to read through these notes and digest them. All right, so just a very quick summary. We have already finished the video lessons for chapter 5, and in this chapter, we've already gone through aerobic respiration and aerobic respiration. Under aerobic respiration, we learned about glycolysis, link reaction, the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, and oxidative phosphorylation. Whereas under anaerobic respiration, which is what we did for this video, we learned about glycolysis and lactate fermentation, as well as alcohol fermentation, and also their uses and importance to our industry. Now that we finished the chapter, what should you do now? Please go ahead and complete the Chapter 5 anaerobic worksheet. And you should also complete the tutorial questions for Chapter 5, all the parts. And last but not least, answer the Google form quizzes for this subtopic. There should be 2 quizzes in the Google Classroom. That's pretty much it from me. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I will see you again in the next lesson. Thank you, and bye!